Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's session of the Berkeley Forum. My name is Aparna Iyer. I'm currently the president of the forum, and we're so excited to welcome Mark Safarik to the virtual stage. Before we begin, we have a few items for the audience to pay attention to. There is an attendance form available at tinyurl.com/Safarik form that we encourage you to fill out. And you can submit questions for our moderator to read aloud at tinyurl.com/Safarik questions. Additionally, before we begin, the Berkeley Forum would like to take the time to acknowledge that our events and UC Berkeley's campus sit on the territory of the Ohlone people. And it's important for us to recognize this because we benefit from the continued occupation of this land and because the Muwekma Ohlone people are still alive and present within Berkeley and the greater Bay Area today. For more Native education resources on campus, we encourage you to look to the Centers for Educational Justice and Community Engagement. And with that, it's my pleasure to invite up our event manager for the evening to introduce our speaker, Christina Lee.
So Mark Safarik was a member of the FBI's Elite Behavioral Analysis Unit and an internationally recognized expert in the analysis of violent criminal behavior. He served 23 years with the FBI, 12 of those as a criminal profiler. He is well published in international journals and has authored numerous book chapters on homicide. His book, Spree Killers, Practical Classifications for Law Enforcement and Criminology, is a definitive textbook on this type of multicide. He has appeared on numerous true crime TV shows, including his television series, Killer Instinct, and was also a longtime consultant for the popular television series CSI Las Vegas, Bones, and The Blacklist. And now it's my pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage, Mark Safarik.
Hi, Mark, really quickly, I think you're muted. So if you could just really quickly just unclick that. Sorry about that. No, you're totally good. Go ahead.
Am I good now?
Yes, perfect.
I thought I unmuted myself, but apparently I didn't. Okay.
No problem.
Sorry. Thanks, Christina, for that introduction. And thanks for the Berkeley Forum for inviting me. I appreciate it. It's great. And we've got some time, not a lot, but we've got some time to talk about behavioral analysis, criminal investigative analysis, criminal profiling. But before we get there, I want to just sort of give you a little background. When I got out of college, I had not any interest in going into law enforcement. I was really headed towards medical school, but to keep my hand in this area, in the medical profession, I became a paramedic on an ambulance. And this was in Northern California because I graduated from UC Davis, so very close by. As the more I worked on the ambulance, I worked with law enforcement on shootings and stabbings and all kinds of violent crimes. It became interesting to me what law enforcement officers did, patrol officers did. And I started on a ride-along program, and that got me more and more interested. And eventually, I decided that what I wanted to do was not go into medicine, but to go into law enforcement. So I became a police officer. Really enjoyed it. I worked patrol for about 3.5 years. So I got my street creds. And then I really wanted to go into investigations because I hated handing off cases that I wanted to investigate. So I put in for investigations. I was promoted into investigations, started off in property crimes, and then went to violent crimes. And the reason I tell you this is because I didn't know anything about profiling. This was in the early 1980s. But I went to a homicide school, and there were 2 FBI profilers that gave us a couple of days of looking at violent crime, complex violent crimes from a very different perspective than what I was used to. I was really more used to crime scene management and dealing with evidence and photographs and diagramming and interviewing witnesses and maintaining scene integrity. And I never really even had the tools to be thinking about how do I look at a case or how do I integrate behavioral dynamics, behavioral aspects of what's happening at a crime scene. And that 2 days really opened my eyes. So I had a couple of homicides. I had a double homicide and a single that I sent back to the FBI for analysis, back to the profiling unit. And that's really what started my journey with the unit. And after about a year, I decided that is really what I wanted to do. I was fascinated by the subject. I was reading everything I could get my hands on, but you have to understand that this was the early 80s. I mean, my former partner, Bob Ressler, coined the term serial killer in 1977. So that's how recent we're really dealing with these types of cases when they were doing their initial research. And I applied to the FBI and I got in after about a year. And then it was my goal to get into the behavioral analysis unit. That took me 11 years of my FBI career. And I worked around the country. I started working in Indian reservation in Wyoming, mostly all violent crimes. And then I went to New York, and then I went back to Sacramento, but always working violent crime until I had the opportunity to apply for the behavioral analysis unit. And I did. And I got that job. This is what I had always wanted to do. It took me a long time to get there. But once I was in the unit, I stayed until I retired. So I retired after 23 years, but I stayed in the unit about 12 and a half years. When I was invited by Bob Ressler, who was one of the pioneers, if you've ever read anything about behavioral profiling or any articles, most articles will reference Robert Ressler and his work. So I joined Bob as his partner in the business that I have now, which is forensic behavioral services. And I've had this business now for about 14 years. I do the same kind of work, the same kind of analysis, looking at complex violent crime cases. I had done everything in the unit that I wanted to do. I taught all over the world. I did research. And that came about actually about a year after I got into the unit. I was working in sexual homicide, and I ended up getting a couple of cases of elderly women who'd been raped and murdered brutally in Colorado. And, you know, the first thing you do when you get a case that you don't understand or you don't know what's going on, you don't have any familiarity with this type of homicide, is you go to the research literature. What does the research tell you? What can you find out? And the fact was there was no research that had ever been done on this type of sexual homicide. So I decided to start research in this area. And now to this day, I'm still publishing in this area. I've published a number of book chapters, peer-reviewed journal articles, and I've lectured all over the country on this particular area. It's a small area of sexual homicide, but it's a fascinating area. And when law enforcement agencies get these kinds of cases, they often don't know what they are dealing with, what type of an offender that they would be dealing with. So research, teaching, working cases, complex cases around the country and around the world. I've traveled all over the world working on unusual cases because the FBI, although I know in television, it looks like the FBI comes in and takes over a case, but we don't do that, especially in the type of work that I do. We have to be invited in to an agency's case, and we will assist them in a very narrow area within criminal profiling, within behavioral analysis, crime scene analysis, offer our assistance oftentimes in unsolved cases, usually cold cases. And then we leave it to them. We may make recommendations, and then they can follow those recommendations. And hopefully what we're hoping is that they will then follow up with us, you know, how the recommendations we made worked out. So we come in quietly, we go out quietly on these types of cases. But it's a fascinating subject, and I have worked on many complex cases. I testified in the Spokane serial murder case. I testified or I was prepared to testify in the Rodney Alcala case. Rodney Alcala was a serial killer in California. He was the dating game killer, but he'd also killed others around the country, 2 in New York, 1 in Wyoming. I've been around a lot of different cases, complex cases. And that's the thing I think people have to understand is that behavioral analysis in homicide cases, that most homicide cases are not amenable to being behaviorally assessed because you need complex behavior. You need what we call psychopathology within the crime scene. So most violent crimes, most homicides occur between people who know each other. There is a history for law enforcement. There's forensic evidence that's compelling. There's witnesses, or there's a history like gang killings or drug killings where police know generally the environment that this homicide is occurring in. The problem comes when you have homicides that don't appear to have a motive or where police can't make a connection between the offender and the victim. If you have a lot of excessive violence, if you have a lot of other activity occurring at the scene, perhaps before the murder or after the murder, during the murder, if you have other unusual activities or behavior like eating or sleeping or bathing at the crime scene, if you have an extended period of time that the offender remains at the scene, if you have the offender transporting living victims, those are the kinds of cases that are really on the extreme end of human behavior. Those cases have a lot of psychopathology, and sexual homicides tend to fall within that category. So a lot of cases just are not good cases for being behaviorally assessed. So you need a lot of complexity in the case. You need either multiple victims or multiple offenders or other aspects that I've been talking about. So those kinds of cases we have to vet when they came into the unit because the unit was fairly small. We had 8 criminal profilers in the adult crimes unit, which is the unit that I was in. And we're covering the entire country and many international locations that ask for assistance. So we tend to get the very unusual cases, which always includes the spree murder cases, the serial murder cases, sometimes mass murder cases, but those are often solved rather quickly. Equivocal death cases, equivocal deaths where the manner of death is not known. So is it a homicide? Is it a suicide? Is it an accident? Law enforcement's not sure what they're dealing with, so we can look at that. If you have cases where you have other unusual types of behavior, like staging behavior, where the offender stages the crime scene to look like something else, or if you have depersonalization going on at a crime scene or undoing behavior. Those are phenomenons that are not well understood by your average homicide investigator because they don't deal with those types of behavioral dynamics. But those are the types of behavioral dynamics that we dealt with all the time. So I wanted to just give you some sort of brief, I've got a couple of slides I'd like to show you if I can. I want to share this with you so you get a sense of what I'm talking about. Is that shared now? Hopefully we can see that. Is it shared, Christina, do you know? Okay. So criminal profiling, really, you see that in the television shows, and they're always talking about criminal profilers and criminal profiling. But criminal profiling is really one aspect of an overarching umbrella a constellation of other services that we offer called criminal investigative analysis. Criminal profiling is one of those. And this is really the description of criminal profiling, the process of drawing inferences about an offender's characteristics from the details of the offense and the way it was committed. So what we're really trying to do is to take the crime scene and integrate the physical evidence, the forensic evidence, and the behavioral evidence into a constellation that helps us understand what's going on. Our assumption based on human behavior is that the crime and the crime scene reflect the habits and personality of the offender. So here are different aspects. You don't really ever hear about these when you watch television shows about criminal profiling, but sometimes they're not asking us about criminal profiling. They may be asking us about an interview strategy for a particular suspect that they have. They may be asking us about an equivocal death analysis or investigative suggestions for their case. Sometimes, like in the Spokane serial murder case, I'm doing linkage analysis. So I testified about the 14 homicides that occurred in Spokane and the 2 homicides that occurred just south of Seattle in Pierce County. How do I link those cases together? What are those linkages? Sometimes we're developing media strategies. So if we're trying to draw someone out, or we're trying to bring attention to people that may know the offender. So there's a lot of these that I'm showing on the screen. They're all things that we can do. Expert testimony work, I've done it many times. But the basis for everything that we do is the crime and crime scene analysis, because you have to understand what the offender is doing and why he's doing it. So it just means that criminal profiling is not the only thing that we do. It's one thing we do. And it mostly happens with cold cases or cases where your offender is unknown, which is often a lot of the cases. So the idea for me is that I have to tell the story of this complex crime. I have to tell it to a jury. I have to tell it to law enforcement. I have to make sense of it. Every crime has a flow to it. And the flow of the crime, the things that happen both chronologically and temporally in time, have to make sense. And it's okay if things are missing. It's just that you have to be able to explain why things are missing that you expect to be there, or why things are there that you don't expect to be there. But there's a flow that happens to every crime, whether it's a break-in burglary or a robbery or a vandalism. There's a flow to the crime. Things happen in an order. And when things get out of order, if they don't make sense forensically or behaviorally, then we may have some other dynamic that's going on. So what I do is I study every behavioral, forensic, physical detail about the crime scene. So it's essentially a microanalysis of what's going on. Now, remember what I said was most crimes of violence, most homicides are not good cases for using behavioral analysis on. They're just simply not enough psychopathology. They're not complex enough. All right, so I talked about psychopathology. So the question I'm trying to answer is what happened? What happened? How did events unfold or occur? And ultimately, why? What is the motive in this crime? And what does it tell me about the dynamic between the victim and the offender? One of the really important aspects of what I do is victimology, trying to understand why a particular victim became the victim of a violent crime. There's a lot of different aspects to victimology. These are some of them. So it's more than just me asking, well, what was this person like? And getting a response that, well, she was a good mother, everybody loved her, she participated in the school projects. And I need much more detail. I need to understand her background, her risk, her habits, whether those are criminal habits or sexual habits or psychological issues, work habits. relationships with friends, family, coworkers. And I get that by interviewing a lot of different people, or having law enforcement having interviewed a lot of different people. Ultimately, what I'm trying to figure out is, what is her risk level? What is her risk for becoming the victim of a violent crime? We have all heard this if we watch television shows, that there are high risk victims like sex workers, prostitutes, people who are drug dealers. They have high risk lifestyles. And that's fine, but not all victims are high risk. Some are medium risk, some are low risk, have risk that's situational. On the flip side of that, what is the risk that the offender is willing to take to commit the crime? So if you have a prostitute who is killed in the middle of the night, a high-risk victim, works under the cover of darkness by herself and goes with people she doesn't know in their vehicle to a location she may not be familiar with, that means it's probably very low risk for the offender. So for a low risk offender, high risk victim, the offender pool becomes very large. Now, if you flip that, just because this woman was a prostitute doesn't mean that she's always high risk. So you have to look at the situation that she's in. If she's not working, if she's home and someone breaks into her house or into her apartment where she's with her children, that is much higher risk for the offender. So then the question is, why is the offender willing to take that amount of risk? So I'm always weighing risk for victim versus risk for offender. It's the two-sided coin, right? Different risks. And I'm trying to understand that. What else am I looking at? Injury, because we're talking about homicides mostly. Injury becomes very important. And I've published on this area, and I've also developed a homicide injury scale that has been found in other journals to be significant. My question always was, well, is there a difference between somebody who gets stabbed once and dies and someone who gets stabbed 200 times? I think there was a great deal of difference. The problem was you always had a constant. The victim always died. So it didn't really matter if she was stabbed once, shot once, hit over the head once, or it happened 50 times. But I thought there was a difference for offenders, and I've published on this area. But when we talk about injuries, I'm not just interested in how she gets killed or how he gets killed. I'm interested in all these dynamics. What are the severity of the injuries? How many? Where are they? Are they post-mortem? Are they ante-mortem? Are they perimortem? What was the weapon? How many weapons? Did the offender leave the weapon, take the weapon, bring the weapon? So there's a lot of different dynamics that all become pieces of this puzzle I'm trying to put together. So I'm also looking at the cause of death, or how many causes of death do we have? And then a very critical piece is MO, the modus operandi of the offender versus their ritual behavior. And I can talk about that maybe briefly in another slide here. Post-mortem activities. So what's happening after the death? Is there sexual assault after the death? Is there movement of the body after the death? Is there dismemberment? Is there exploration? So is there removal of body parts? What is actually going on, at post-mortem? And then can I tell if injuries are ante-mortem or superficial or fatal injuries or defensive injuries? So all of these pieces are small, but they all start to help fill in the puzzle of what I'm looking at. What is the motive for this crime? What's the level of planning and organization? Does the offender exert control in this crime scene? Or did he have control and lose control? Or did he never have control? Is the whole scene a mess? Is it like he tried to get control and never could get control? What does that tell me about the case? How did he get into the scene, his ingress? How did he get out of the scene? Is it the same way? Is it complicated? All of these pieces are things that I'm looking at. All of these attributes are something I'm looking at. So I'm trying to understand what is the constellation of all this together. Because I don't want to just pull one piece out and go, what does this piece mean? Because this piece by itself may not mean anything. It only means something really within the context of everything else that's happening, because those things are all interrelated. So I always try to think of it in terms of the totality of the circumstances of the event. And as I said earlier, telling the story of the crime, the flow of the crime. So if you have staging in a crime scene, then you're not going to have the flow is going to be interrupted. And you will recognize it now. Staging can be done very well, or it can be done very poorly. I've testified in cases with both. So body disposal. Body disposal is a really critical piece because it's essentially like a decision tree. So after the homicide, you have the victim's body. So what are your decisions? Well, you can leave the body there. That's what most offenders do in most homicides. If you don't leave it there, you can transport it. How far do you transport it? Within the residence, within the location? Or do you take it into a vehicle, take it somewhere else? Then if you transport it, what are you doing with it? Are you dumping it? Are you burying it? Are you posing it? Are you putting it in a specific place in a specific way? All of these things become important in the analysis. I'm trying to understand not who the exact offender is. What I'm trying to understand is, what is that relationship? Why is this offender in this crime? And what is that relationship to this victim? What is that dynamic? That's why we need a lot of psychopathology. That's why average cases don't really fit. Can't really use behavioral profiling or criminal profiling on those cases. The more unusual, the more violent, the more complex the case, the better for us, the more psychopathology. The longer the offender is there, the more things he does. And we integrate that with the physical evidence, with witness interviews, with forensic evidence to basically understand what's going on in this crime and why. And then other activities. So I won't talk about cognitive biases, but it's something that I have to be very careful with in any case. And the reason is this. Typically, when we work a case, we're getting a case from law enforcement and they have already worked for a long period of time. We don't, unless it's really a serial murder case or a really bizarre sexual homicide case, we typically don't get called in right away. Homicide detectives are very good. They're top notch and they know what they're doing. So they work a case, but eventually in some cases, they run out of leads. There's just nothing going on. So they may ask for essentially a behavioral look at the scene. Is there something that we see that they don't see here? And that's helpful. It's a very narrow range of work for us. And we try to offer investigative suggestions and try to piece together perhaps the personality dynamics of an individual like this, type of job they might have, where they might live, how they might interact with neighbors or coworkers or family members, how they would react to the media. Perhaps we can develop media strategies, or maybe we would say, don't. This guy isn't going to follow the media. We can't, there's no point in developing media strategies. So I don't want to be biased by the work that the investigators have done. They clearly believe that the direction they've taken their case is the right direction, or else they wouldn't have taken it. But I can't ascribe to that. So it's my job to really be impartial. So I want to look at all of the evidence myself. I don't want them presenting it to me, because they'll present what they think is important and they may leave out things that I think are important. So I want to look and review everything myself. And that's really critical, to be completely objective about this. I essentially don't have a dog in the fight. I don't have ties to the victims' families, emotional ties to the victims or victims' families. Don't have emotional ties to the suspect or suspects' families or witnesses. I am removed from this, and I need to stay impartial, because oftentimes by the time the case comes to me, the police are coming to us because they've run out of leads. So who is standing in the shoes of the victim now? If I become emotional about the case, if I ascribe immediately to a direction the detectives are going, then I may jeopardize what I really could find in the case. So I don't want to be cognitively biased. I want to, and the big one for law enforcement is confirmation bias. We look for things that support our theories, and we tend to ignore the evidence that doesn't support our theories, when we should do exactly the opposite. We should always be trying to disprove the theory that we have. So that's a very important component. Another really critical aspect is something that I mentioned before, is MO and ritual. In complex violent crime cases, serial sexual assault cases, or homicide cases, you're trying to understand what is the offender's MO? What are the things that he's doing to be successful in the crime? What is he doing to protect his identity? What is he doing to get away? It's the things that he perceives will make him successful at committing the crime. Those are his MO. Now, as offenders learn and commit more crimes, they get better at it. And they change their MO. Their MO should improve. It should improve because they get better. They may almost get seen by somebody. They may almost get caught. Then the next time they're thinking, okay, I have to fix that. Or maybe they have a victim who fights back. They didn't expect that. They're a rapist. And first couple of rape victims, they had the victims acquiesced out of fear. But the third victim fights back. That now, the next time they're like, whoa, I wasn't even able to complete the sexual assault. I fled. So what do I do now? Do I threaten them? Do I bring something to tie them up with? Do I bring a weapon? So you see the MO can change and likely will over time. So in the serial murder case, in the Spokane serial murder case, Robert Yates had 23 years between the first killing that we were aware of in 75 and the last killings in 98 that we were aware of. Well, 23 years is a long time to improve your ability to kill, which he did. Now that is opposed to the term, what I call ritual. Well, we all call ritual. Some people call it signature, but signature is something that's a little bit different. Signature you can find in both MO and ritual, but ritual behavior is need-based. It's emotionally, psychologically driven. That there's a need to engage in this behavior. Not that they always understand why, but there's a need to engage in it. And the interesting thing is that typically it increases their risk because it forces them to stay at these crime scenes longer, to engage in that behavior. And it can be anything from eating to mutilation, to moving the body, to posing the body, to displaying the body, to a lot of different areas. Can be bondage, can be looked at as ritualized. Essentially, I ask myself the question, does this behavior I'm looking at, does it make him successful? No. Does it help him protect his identity or help him get away? No. So likely that behavior is more tied to his ritual. The important thing about ritual is that it typically does not change over time. So Yates had, and most serial offenders will have ritual behaviors they engage in, that you see them in their early crimes, but you also see them in their later crimes. Why? Because it's not related to getting better. It's related to something that I have to do, that I need to do, that I want to do as a part of this crime. So differentiating between those. is helpful, especially when you get into court and you can say, here are the MO behaviors. This is why he does these. And here are the things he does consistently in the other crimes that have nothing to do with his MO or his ritual or need-driven behavior. So I don't know if have I gone over 20 minutes? I probably have. So anyway, I think that, are we ready for some questions? I could literally talk all night about this kind of stuff. But I was just trying to give you really sort of an overview flavor of what it is we're really doing when we look at cases like this, look at complex cases. It's not like Criminal Minds. We're not flying off to all over the place. We're not doing DNA tests in 5 minutes. We're not analyzing blood spatter. There are experts to do that. We're not experts in pathology, but we certainly understand forensic pathology, and we understand how to read an autopsy report and what those things mean. But we really try to stick to a very narrow area for assisting law enforcement with these cases.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Mark, for that insightful address. We can now move on to the Q&A portion. So it's my pleasure to invite up our student moderator for the evening from the Berkeley Forum, Aliyah Behimino.
Mark, it's a pleasure to have you at the forum.
Thank you. I appreciate it being here. Yeah.
You today. Yes, thank you as well. I just want to remind everyone in the audience that we have a question form pinned in the comments. So if you have a question you'd like to ask Mark, please feel free to fill out that form, and we will be taking a few of these questions at the end. So Mark, thank you for this in-depth explanation of how investigators approach homicide. While some would consider this field of work discomforting, what draws you to this work, and what, in your opinion, draws other people to this work as well?
I think what drove me, well, first of all, if I go back to when I was a police officer, I really liked investigating cases. I liked the complexity of, completing an investigation, figuring out what's going on. So when I was a patrol officer, always having to hand a case off and then going back to do the initial paperwork, I didn't want to do that. So when I got into investigations, it's really sort of the puzzle of, figuring it all out from evidence and interviews. But there's nothing more complex than homicide, because your victim can't help you. You have to figure out all this information from yourself, and you have to use other disciplines of expertise: forensic pathology, blood spatter analysis, forensic entomology, forensic botany, psychopathy, group juvenile behavior, group dynamics, death investigation. All of these can play a role, and you need to have some level of expertise in them to bring that to bear in homicide investigations. Then when I got into the Bureau, you are really working as a profiler on the most complex cases. And really it's based on my education, my training, and my experiential aspect, which I think is critical, having looked at thousands and thousands of homicide cases and starting to see patterns in behavior. But I think I really like the challenge of homicide, and the more complex the case, the more unusual the case, the more interesting it is to me. But I also like being in that position where, you may be the last person that can really help in a case like this. You may find the minimal clues that really good homicide investigators just can't see, because they don't have that training that can help move a case over the top. I've testified in lots of cases, and cases that had good evidence, but sometimes the jury needs to understand these dynamics to help push the case over the top, because things like staging and undoing, depersonalization are not concepts well understood by law enforcement.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your personal insight and what draws you into this work. Related back to your work, I'd like to ask you a question on the specific of some cases you handled. So in your paper, Sexual Homicide of Elderly Females, you noted that many victims died from injuries in excess what would be necessary for death, and often come from particularly vulnerable populations. In your experience, what can an offender's decision to commit overkill, as opposed to a standard homicide, tell you about the psychological or social biases that they hold?
That's a great question. And that's an interesting dynamic, because you would think that in an elderly population, and I'm talking about women, at least in my study, that were 65 years or older, but in actuality, I had very few victims between 65 and 70. Most were 70 in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. So the question you ask is, how come I see so much violence directed at a target, a woman who is so vulnerable and so easy to control? Because you don't have to inflict that much injury to control or to sexually assault her. So why was I seeing it? It tends to be a much younger population. The most violent offenders there are between 15 and 24. They're acting out in anger, in motives of anger and rage and control. These are typically socially inadequate individuals who have very little control in their own lives. And they're socially and sexually inadequate. And so this is why they attack a population of the elderly population, because they know that they can control someone that old. And then they vent that frustration, that anger on those women, both sexually assaulting them and then killing them. It's really tragic.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your insight in spite of the tough themes that you discussed. Finally, for the sake of time, this will be my last question before we move on to audience questions. But in light of recent Black Lives Matter protests, a summer 2020 Gallup poll found that 52% of American adults do not trust law enforcement. Given your experience, what do you hope for the future of law enforcement?
Oh gosh, it's a difficult question. Every officer I've ever worked with has been professional, dedicated to the job. In any profession, you're going to have people that got in because for reasons that weren't good reasons. And law enforcement has tried and keeps trying to weed people like that out. I know even when I became a police officer, I had to go through a psychological examination. When I became an FBI agent, I had to go through a psychological testing. So there are attempts to get people like that out. I mean, the vast majority of law enforcement are hardworking people, dedicated to the job, dedicated to public safety. And it's unfortunate that you get people, and it really bothers me when I see someone, it's in my profession, that's taken advantage. Like the guy that was just arrested, who just killed a couple people yesterday in Austin, Texas. This is a former Travis County detective, charged with sexual assaulting a 16-year-old. I mean, those kind of cases make me really angry, because I don't ever want to see people like that in law enforcement. But I think the vast majority of law enforcement is doing a good job, trying to do the best job they can.
Thank you for answering all of my questions, Mark. I will now be transitioning to questions that we had from the audience. Sure. So our first question comes from Nancy, and they ask, what are some of the other fields or career backgrounds that you see aside from law enforcement joining the BAU? If I want to join the BAU, the Behavioral Analysis Unit, that is, do I have to come from a law enforcement background? Is it recommended?
Okay, good question. So the profilers in the Behavioral Analysis Unit are all special agents, and they're all supervisory special agents. So to be a profiler in the FBI, you have to be in law enforcement. You don't have to come from law enforcement. We have lots of agents that were teachers or attorneys in other fields that became FBI agents, but then you are a law enforcement officer. So all the profilers are law enforcement. Now, with that said, we have a number of analysts, researchers who assist us. They are support personnel, but they are not FBI agents and they're not profilers. But we work, very closely with them. The researchers and analysts in VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, across the U.S. Are excellent people. They're trained in linkage analysis, and our work would not be complete without them. But to do profiling work in the Bureau and in most agencies that have profiling units, you're going to have to be a law enforcement officer.
Great. So our second audience question is from Cheyenne, and they ask, what's the biggest difference between crime shows like Criminal Minds and real investigations?
Oh, I think probably you understand that the crime shows, and I consulted for CSI Las Vegas for 8 years, and the Blacklist and M-Bones. Those shows have to entertain. Because if you were to do what I do, I sit in an office and I look at stacks of case materials. It's pretty boring, right? There's not a lot of interest. I think those agents and those shows do too much. They can't do blood spatter analysis. They can't do DNA analysis. They are not pathologists. They can't walk to a crime scene and look over a body and go, oh yeah, this is what's going on here. Most of the time, they're not ever at live crimes because we don't get called into those kinds of crimes. I think the biggest mistake is that they think in the shows they do a lot, but our focus is very narrow and is really, as I was saying earlier, in just complex cases and doing the assessment of the crime and crime scene to understand those dynamic relationships between victims and the offenders, and what does that tell you about the offender? How can we discern information that will help us or help law enforcement to find them? But so much, needs to be entertaining. So you see them doing a lot of things. The other thing that's not accurate is that they don't all go on one case. We had 8 people in my unit. I was lucky if I could get one other agent to go with me out on a serial murder case. Oftentimes you're traveling by yourself on a case. So we're not all flying off together, all 8 of you in the unit on one case. It just never ever happens. We do it in consultations in the unit where you can get 4 or 5 on a consult for a case. But traveling to go work on a case doesn't happen.
Thank you, Mark. So for my last question of the evening, it's similar also to shows versus real life. And an anonymous member in the audience asks, in shows such as Bones and the Blacklist, FBI agents are often depicted as having a partner who they consistently work with throughout the show. In reality, how, if at all, as you already touched upon, you all don't work in groups as much when flying. How, if at all, do Bureau agents interact with each other to solve crime?
Oh, we do. So we do work together. And honest, every case I ever worked on, I always consulted with someone else. Now, I did have a partner in the behavioral unit. I had my partner was Mary Ellen O'Toole. I knew her from San Francisco. We were coordinators together. I was the coordinator in the Sacramento division. She was in the San Francisco division. We got into the unit together. We became partners. We were partners for 12 years. So she is excellent, top-notch profiler. So we always consulted on the cases we had with one another. And then there were other profilers I consulted with. I rarely ever worked a case by myself. I worked the case up, but then I would go to somebody else and say, hey, here's what I've been thinking about this case. Here's what's going on, and this is how I'm looking at it. What do you think? So there's a lot of give and take, what I would call tribal wisdom when we have consultations. So we bring in an agency, say from England, like the Strathclyde Police Department we had on a mass murder case. We had 5 profilers in our unit. It was an all-day consultation. So now you have other profilers with expertises in specific areas of homicide all weighing in, which I call tribal wisdom, weighing in on the assessment. So we do work a lot with partners, and we do work a lot with each other. The way but the part about the show that is not accurate is that you don't have the whole team working on one case exclusively. There's just way too many cases. We had so many cases. When you only have 8 profilers in the adult crimes unit, and you're servicing the country and the world, because we have FBI offices around the world, you just don't have the luxury of the entire team working on one case. It just doesn't happen. But we did consult with one another all the time.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark, for joining us again at the forum.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure speaking with you and hearing your address. I would now like to pass it over to Aparna for some final wrap-ups to the event.
Thank you, Aaliyah and Mark, and a huge virtual round of applause for the speaker and our moderator for the evening. We really appreciate you being here tonight. And in fact, as a token of our appreciation, at every single one of our events, our communications team designs a custom poster for the event, and this one is no exception. So this was designed for you by Kelsey Kwan from our communications team.
Nice.
Yeah, glad you like it. And at this point, actually, if you have any final remarks that you'd like to make to the audience, you can feel free to do that just to close out.
I would say, I would like to, I guess my goal when I do these cases is, first and foremost for me, is the victim, because most of the cases I work are homicide cases. So I always am thinking about the victim, because I feel sometimes I'm the last person and I need to stand in the shoes of the victim to understand what's going on. John Steinbeck once said that, I think it was in, I know it, it's in one of his novels, but he said, we often live in rooms of experience that we can never enter. And I think that's the way I see the work that I do. I could never be a murderer, but I have to think like one. I live in that room of experience that I could actually never enter. And my goal is to give some closure and justice to the victims and the victims' family, because oftentimes, as you well understand, watching a lot of these true crime documentaries, the victims get lost in these shows and they become about the offender. But ultimately, I always feel a very heavy duty to help the victims and their families get justice in these cases.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And again, we really appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you.
So just to close out, I'd like to give a quick recognition to all the people here who worked on this event, putting things together from the forum's end. So shout out to them for helping out with that. And to our audience, thank you so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. You can fill out the feedback form to offer any suggestions for speakers or event quality at tinyurl.com/forumfeedbackspring21. If you'd like to keep up with what the forum is doing, we encourage you to like us on Facebook or visit our website at forum.berkeley.edu.
Yeah, lastly, thank you, your audience, for joining. I appreciate that as well.
I'm glad. I'm sure there were a lot of them. And lastly, if you are willing and able, we would love it if you could help support us. Any amount goes towards putting on more events, and so our Venmo is linked below. So to the audience, thank you once again for spending your evening at the Berkeley Forum, and we'd love to see you